Kuno podcast today, everybody. We've got Aden Nippon with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
So we've got today's episode on the podcast audio and YouTube visually, so you can choose from the platforms we spoil you here at Kuno. So Aden is particularly qualified in leadership. She's got TEDx talks. She's got her courses that she does. She does so much in this area. So Aden, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction as to how you got where you are and what you do now?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. There are lots of ways to access me. But the way I sort of sum up what I do is I help people create healthier dynamics on their team. So I want people to have more fun in the work that they're doing, communicate more effectively, and get better results. And um, the way I do that is I use a combination of um, great listening skills, great collaboration skills, and sometimes I pull from my background as a stage performer in improvisation. There are tools from that world that are helpful in building trust, getting on the same page quickly, and building on great ideas.
I absolutely love this fusion of improv, acting, and leadership. And some people might say, well, actually, you're not supposed to act as a leader, you're meant to be authentic. And some people might say, well, it helps me to maybe even pretend that I'm doing this so I can build my own skills. Where do you think the kind of connection is in there?
That's a really good question. So, yeah, authenticity is a little bit tricky. There's a wonderful TED Talk. I can't remember the speaker right now, who he demonstrates why you don't want people to be 100% authentic as part of his TED Talk. He's like, actually, don't do that. What you want to do is build trust with people. And so, where I think my particular skill set comes in is it is an authentic thing to build trust. You have to mean it in order to do it. But if you're worried about um, authenticity specifically, and only worried about authenticity, there's a danger of bringing your whole self to the table when what you want to bring is your best self. Um, so it's not that you should be inauthentic. You should absolutely be authentic, but you should pick and choose where and when and how you are being vulnerable, where and when and how you are being brutally honest. And more times rather than not, the emphasis should be on how do you serve, how do you listen well, and how do you bring people together, as opposed to how do I show up to be listened to or trusted. It's reverse. The more that you can focus on your, actually, this is a tie into performance. So as a performer, the more that you can focus on your audience's needs and wants and responses, the better your show is. The same is true as a leader. The more that you can focus on your audience, which in your case is sometimes your board of directors, or sometimes it's the people who report to you. But the more you can focus on their needs, their desires, and what they need in order to be successful, the better you show up. The more you focus on, am I showing up authentically, the less authentically you show up. Does that make sense? It's kind of like one of those like concepts, but that's
It's
how I think about it.
because to show up authentically, a lot of people think is to be vulnerable, but they say, well, be vulnerable in the right circumstance. And sometimes when you want to kind of show up and be authentic, it's not quite coming across in the right way. And I've actually found myself that doing some sort of acting stops me from behaving in a bad way sometimes, or not, not in a way that would be conducive for my team to be working at their best. So how do I kind of balance that vulnerability and the way that I'm working within my team as a leader?
Well, so when I work with my clients, and one of the things that one of the ways to work with me, I do a lot of speaking and training, but I like to work with people one on one who are in this transition period from being really great at their jobs to being elevated up into leadership roles, because it's a different skill set where you move from uh, being great at something to fostering somebody else's greatness. And the trap when you're in that transition is to think that the way that you did everything is the correct way. And this is one of those dangers of authenticity versus vulnerability. So I think when leadership coaches, when people like me tell people to tap into vulnerability, what they're really saying is, um, in order to build trust, you have to support other people in discovering their methodology. So that's where you ask them for help on something, which may seem vulnerable. But in actuality, what you're doing is you're encouraging them to build their own internal sense of leadership. You're going to get more out of people who are challenged and engaged and excited about the work that they're doing. So it's less about like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to tell you, oh, I'm so sorry I'm late because my kid had a thing and then I was in traffic and I'm really vulnerable right now because I'm stressed out. I didn't have my coffee. That's not what we mean. What we mean is be willing to take that risk that someone has a better way of doing things than you did to get you to where you are.
Do you think there's any kind of point of mindset in there? Because when you go from, and especially with entrepreneurs, when you go from being a worker to a director, or you go from doing the job but then leading people on the job, that's a huge transition, and it's one that a lot of people have a lot of trouble with. Is there kind of a mindset component to that? And have you got any advice for people in that situation?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. So one of the many hats that I wear, I work in addition to working as a speaker and coach and president of Art of Change, which is my business. I'm also one of the senior facilitators at On Your Feet Improvisation for Business. And one of the things that we work with people on is something called mantra, which is what it sounds like. It's just like in meditation where you repeat something as a mantra. And it's transformative because here's what typically happens when people are experiencing insecurity. They have a mantra, whether they've chosen it on purpose or not. And it's something like, I hope I'm doing okay, or this could suck. Or they may be saying to themselves, I'm not good enough. Um, Things like that. People are going to figure out I'm a fraud. These are really common messages people feed themselves. But those habits of thoughts don't really serve when you're serving others. And so, what choosing a mantra on purpose does for you is it helps shift your focus onto being of service to others. And helpful mantras are things like, I can help them. Um, they're going to need this information is a really, really helpful mantra in situations like feedback or um, conveying whether a project has succeeded or hasn't succeeded. So it's sort of like taking that, how are they going to react to me out of it? And again, putting that focus on other. And the more you can do that, the better off you'll be. So yeah, mindset is huge. Um, in fact, I gave a TEDx talk that's all about embracing change. And speaking of vulnerability, I shared a very personal story. There is a misconception that as leaders, and in my case, as consultants who work with leaders, that we can't ever be honest about our challenges. And I think this is another piece of that vulnerability that you were asking about. But acknowledging those moments where you had to make a choice about your internal mantra, like those things are helpful in guiding other people to do the same. And so, um, for me in my own journey, I definitely have had those moments where my mantra sucked, where it was self-sabotagey, where it was getting in my way and tapping into these habits of thought that don't serve. So in order to tap into patterns of behavior that do, I had to make a choice. And sometimes it's simply do more of what's working. I mean, it's really, I could go on, but I think you get it.
How do you see these skills kind of working within the virtual environment? Because it was a lot easier when we were all face to face. You can kind of pick up a lot easier on body language and emotion, especially when you're teaching kids as well, like I used to do. When you then go to virtual lessons, it's very difficult to know what's that person feeling. Can I be vulnerable with them? Might they take it the wrong way? Or when you're emailing and it becomes a bit more impersonal, what kind of skills can I take with me there to kind of improve my leadership?
Great question. Um, I find that when I'm working with people one on one, it's easier than when I'm doing a full group training, for example, um, or if I'm working collaboratively with a group of people to create something. That being said, it's not impossible. People's faces are still really expressive, and the trick is not to get into assumption territory about what you're seeing, because what we're seeing now is more of what people's faces look like when they're listening than we noticed before because we're focused on the face. So something that I've noticed, and uh, it's really true for me is the more I can hide my self view in a Zoom meeting, the better I am at listening in a natural way and paying attention. And I can really pick up on the ebb and flow of those conversations when I'm not staring in a mirror during a conversation. So that's one thing that's been helping me in the digital environment. Um, but I think being willing to let people have their listening faces on is helpful instead of needing them to entertain you with their facial expressions. Um, I encourage my clients to look out the window and think. I encourage them to doodle if they need to doodle. And I do that because I want people to hear what's being said. I want them to feel invited to participate fully. And if they have to be putting on a show for my entertainment, they're not going to do that. So my suggestion is simply allow space for people to just be people and quit assuming that just because someone is staring off that they're not listening. And I think that's particularly important for teachers because they're, I've seen this at home with my little one. She's in second grade and she is a multitasker, which we are trying to encourage her to focus on one thing at a time. But part of that multitasking is helping her stay focused.
I feel entirely self-conscious now that I'm making expressions into the camera while we're talking them. But it feels so rude to look, out of the window or to then just look down and start making notes or something. It makes me feel like I'm being rude.
I understand that. You know, Prior to all of this, before everyone moved online, I often in my communication workshops would share with people a simple like checklist of things that you can do when you're interacting virtually, and they still apply. So telling people what you're doing will help relieve that pressure. To say, I'm just going to jot down a few notes will relieve the pressure. Now you can look down at your notes. It's totally, but the truth is, setting those expectations in any way, shape, or form will always help. Anything that you can do to bring you and the person that you're communicating with into the same page instead of making assumptions about what they understand about you is helpful. Um, on the phone, I used to uh, describe my environment just a tiny amount so that people could picture where I was. If I was smiling or laughing, I would say that out loud. Um, because you want people to have those visual experiences. So while you don't want to be worried about other people having to put on a show for you, if you feel better expressing your face to them, then express your face. Don't shut that valve off if it's working for you.
It seems really complex, the amount of communication that we have to do. It's like when you're saying, say that you're going to do some notes or say that you're going to do something. It seems that if we're not talking a lot more, that's where things can go wrong and we can misunderstand. And I remember from being in an office, it's easy enough to get the communication messed up being together. So I think the
Mhm.
temptation is to worry a huge amount more, especially when we're doing email and we're writing words and the emotion's not in there and people can't necessarily pick that up. I think it's tempting to be a bit more anxious about communication now that we are where we are.
It totally makes sense. I understand why that would be. But the truth is these kind of anxieties they're a little bit evergreen. There's always going to be reasons to be worried that it's not working. There's always going to be evidence if you look for it. Um, and that doesn't necessarily make it true. One of the things that we teach at the Art of Change is the relationship between belief, behavior, and experience. And it's really simple. The way things work in the human brain, this is how unconscious biases work is and conscious ones, in fact. You believe something is true, so you act like that's true, and then you pick and choose evidence in your brain that reinforces and that it's true. And then you get to go, oh, see, and then you continue to believe it and act that way, and then find reinforcement. So, the classic example is if you think someone is stupid, then you treat them like they're stupid, and then they say something like, huh? And you go, see, I knew they were stupid. So, it's just exactly the same in the workplace. If you think this isn't working, it's that mantra. If you think this isn't working, then you're going to act like it's already not working. You're going to start micromanaging, or you're going to start um, giving feedback on projects that aren't finished, um, or in a place where they're in need of feedback in order to grow. And then it's going to start to grind things into a clunky way of operating. And you'll go, see, I knew it wasn't working. So it's really important to get the belief system in place that serves the rest of the cycle. If you're going to pick and choose what to be right about, why not pick and choose being right about stuff that is working and is great?
So how easy is it to do that, and how hard is it to get somebody to do that?
uh, well, we call them practices for a reason. Sometimes people hear these things and it's just it clicks for them. If you've read The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck, then you know that like I read that book, I was so excited. And then I got to the end and I learned basically they told people that they could have a growth mindset, and then they did. It wasn't a fancy training exercise. So for some people, just knowing that by choosing a belief, you're going to behave differently is enough. For other people, it takes practice and reminders. So sometimes when I'm working one-on-one with a client, we will have a 90-minute session and they're good to go for like 8 years. And which is my favorite, if I'm being honest. When I go seek coaching or advice, I want it to be fast. I want it to be effective. But some people need more practice. And you know who you are. You know if you need more practice. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that choosing a helpful mantra or getting really clear on your beliefs and where they are serving and not serving you means that you must choose something that is positive or happy. But that won't always necessarily serve you. It's more about noticing what are you choosing, and would there be a more helpful choice. So in this example of finding out that there's going to be changes that are going to be painful for your team, you are already in assumption territory when you say these changes will be painful for my team. So taking a moment to notice, what am I assuming and is it helpful, is sort of step one. What am I assuming? Is it helpful? It might be helpful to assume that it's going to be painful for your team, because it might set you up to be in a position to say, how might I alleviate that pain as their leader? What are the things that I can anticipate that I can put in place to help them along the journey? And again, you'll notice I've taken it out of, how do I tell them it's going to be so hard? I don't want to be the bad guy. It takes you out of that. So if it's a helpful assumption that can put you into, how do I then help them get through that moment? Fine. But you're assuming a lot of things. Think about when there's probably been times in your life, I'm guilty of this as well, when you didn't invite somebody to attend a thing sort of outside of work. You're like, well, I'm not gonna, I would invite them, but they don't like whatever, blah, blah. So I'm not going to invite them. And then you find out later they would have liked to have been invited. Um, we don't want to fall into that trap of choosing other people's experiences for them without knowing what they care about. So, as a leader, if you already know what your people deeply care about, and I have all kinds of listening practices that I work with my clients on, because you should know that. Not all leaders do. And if you don't, then you don't know if it's going to be a hard change or not. And even if you know those things, you could still be wrong. So, maybe that's a helpful assumption and maybe it's not. So, you know, another more helpful assumption might be, and again, it's going to always be determined by your specific circumstances. But a more helpful assumption might be that it's going to be different. That might be a more helpful assumption. And there's a nuance there. Difference isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just different. You don't want to go in and say, this is going to be really different and it's going to be great because I'm choosing to believe that. Because that can be a bit toxic and off-putting. And speaking of authenticity, can feel really inauthentic.
I think it's very difficult, and I think for many leaders, especially young leaders as well, it's a case of reeling back all these assumptions that you've made and the emotions that are going on and the pressure that you're feeling, and just trying to say, how can I get us all through this difference that's going to happen? And then how am I going to deal with anything that kind of is thrown up from this? And change is never a fun thing, and I think that that's probably one of the hardest things as a leader and as a team member as well, when maybe you feel like you've not got as much power over it, to deal with a
I
lot
want to
of things going on.
I apologize that I'm interrupting, but I want to reflect something that you just said, which is that change is never a fun thing.
I'm guilty again.
And here's why I bring that up. So I host the Changed podcast, which is a passion project of mine. And it all started because I caught myself saying something similar to what you just said, only I was saying it to my kid who was 4 years old at the time and had been wearing dresses, and we wanted her to start wearing pants, and she didn't want to put on pants, which I fully understand. And at the same time, she's like climbing on jungle gyms and stuff. It's like, it's time to put on some pants. And I said to her, change is so hard. And then I went, whoops, is that true? I'm going to check my assumption. So this is the thing that I'm encouraging here. And as I checked that assumption, I went, wait a minute, not all change is hard. Some change is automatic, some change is easy. We change our socks all the time. That's not a big struggle. Um, Sometimes we change our eating habits without thinking about it. Sometimes we change our eating habits and it's a challenge. So it's circumstance based, and it's largely based on how we feel about what we've been doing and how well that's been working for us. And in the cases where change feels the most difficult, it's because we're so deeply attached to what was happening before. And you may need to take time to acknowledge that there's a bit of a loss of what you know. The other thing to say about that is, just because it's familiar doesn't necessarily it's been working for you. Doesn't mean that necessarily. And so sometimes our attachment to something is simply out of that sense of familiarity. You know what you need to be doing differently. You know what would serve you better. But until you are like through with whatever it is that you've been doing out of a sense of it's safe and familiar, it's failure on my terms versus taking a risk and having failure, you've got to have that moment where you come to terms with it, where you give yourself a, okay, I'm going to acknowledge what has been happening. I'm going to acknowledge where my current beliefs lie. I'm going to breathe through that. In some cases, I'm going to cry through that. And I'm going to mourn that moment so that I can move into what's new and be honest about why I'm doing that. What's the value proposition? What am I motivated towards? What am I motivated away from?
So this is probably one of the highest asked questions by leaders, and the sentence that goes with it is, change is never good and change is always bad, and if there's any change, then I'm not going to like it, because it's all change never leads us anywhere good, because I'm not sure why. And big changes tend to kind of scare people as well. So from what you've just said, um, there's a whole mindset there that you need to have as a leader, and a skill set that you need to have to deal with change. And this seems like a really complex thing to be able to handle well. And it needs a lot of trust of letting go, so that your team can kind of experience what they need to experience from it. Are there any kind of fundamental things that you'd suggest that anybody in this position, and I'm going to take notes as well at this point, should probably kind of look at or think about developing, especially for early learners as well, new leaders?
Yeah, there are some essential fundamental skills if you want to navigate change well with your team. Um, and a lot of them are about, I mean, one huge one is of course the mindset piece. You need to get a hold on your mantra around change. I would suggest that in business, change is essential. It's not optional. It's always a good idea. To explore the benefits of certain changes. Not all changes are going to be beneficial to your business, but if a business stays doing the exact same thing for all eternity, it dies. That's just how it works. Think about the bookstores that originally were like, this Amazon thing, I don't like it. And so I'm going to ignore it and pretend it's not happening and see how well they've survived. lot of them have folded. It sucks. I'm sad for those business owners. And at the same time, the business owners that were like, huh, this online thing seems to be gaining traction, and created ways for their customers to engage with them online, they have stayed alive. Some of them have thrived. And that's even as Amazon has continued to change in and of itself. So the idea that change is bad for business, or change is because it's uncomfortable, that it's therefore bad, that's a mistake. So that's thing number one. Change is essential. The other thing to think about as a leader and helping your team navigate through that is you can't just tell them that change is essential and have people believe you, because people have all kinds of different beliefs about change. So keeping the lines of communication open in terms of, how do I, a leader, support what you need? Just checking in. It doesn't have to be intense. You don't have to make a big production of it, but to walk by and be like, hey, how are things going for you this week? Do you need anything? Will go a long way. And building trust is also an essential skill. So as you are navigating that change, asking for your team's input on particular challenges that you are facing that aren't about their projects can be trust building. And it can also communicate to them that you trust their expertise. It's not just that you trust them more when they give you good advice. It's the fact that you're asking them for input on something will demonstrate how much you care about them, and that will build trust in you. So those are some essential, and those are just a few things. There's like, of course, there's lots that you can be working on. Um, and these things sometimes take practice and thought partnership. And that's where someone like me would come in and help. But I I would encourage anybody that those three basic things, you can just go and try. You're, that's important. Think about change in that way, to check in with your people and to build that trust.
Just one final quick example on this. If it's not business change per se, but it's change where maybe your team's getting their pension halved or something, and you don't agree with it, and they don't agree with it, and everybody's unhappy with it, is there a difference in that situation?
That's a really tough one. Um, as a leader, when you don't agree with a decision, but you need everybody to get on board, what should you do with that? I think there are different options. Sometimes the leaders will take this approach of trying to be everybody's friend and be like, look, guys, I know it sucks. I hate it too. It's the worst. We're all the same. And that can be really damaging with the employee relationship with the business as a whole. So that's dangerous. And sometimes it's the right move, but sometimes it's the wrong move. So you have to know your business, know your people, know what that is going to do, or at least have some sense of what that might do. Another choice is to be like, look, this is how it is. Just kind of pull the hard line. And sometimes that's the right move as well. Sometimes that can really tank morale. And it doesn't do anything to nurture the business. What I would suggest as an alternative is, if you as a leader hate something that's happening for the company as a whole and feel like you have to communicate that to your team, you may want to get more information so that you don't have to hate something. Hating something is often about fearing something. And when fear becomes part of the equation, logic flies out the window. So how do you battle that? And it's by getting curious. The more information you have, the less fearful you'll be. So if a huge decision like that is coming down the pike, pensions are being cut in half, or maybe they're being done away with altogether. We're going to replace pensions with a 401k, 5% matching program, whatever it is. Then you should probably understand why that is. And if it's keeping the business afloat to make these important financial decisions, then being transparent about that with your people will help keep the relationship between the people and the company alive. If people understand why the good coffee went out of the break room and there's now really crappy coffee, they tend to be more forgiving than if they don't understand why. If they're asking, if they're not asking, they may not care. So, there's also this assumption that everyone's going to care about it. Most people on a pension decision are going to care about that. Some people on a coffee decision will care about it, but fewer. So that would be my suggestion. I would advise curiosity first before you spend a ton of time in fear and assumption territory.
So coming back to the training that you do, Just to kind of round everything out, is there anything that you kind of recommend as top skills for people to take from, because you've got the whole acting and improv background are there any top skills that you recommend for leaders to kind of, if they're only going to take these skills away, then take these skills away?
I I really think that it's essential, um, in this day and age, the idea that having positional authority is enough to get your team to accomplish what they need to accomplish, that's an outdated idea. It doesn't work that way anymore. People need to feel ownership and pride over the work that they're doing. Intrinsic motivation these days outweighs extrinsic reward, typically. And in order to do that, you've got to be able to trust the people that you have in place to do their job. Full stop. And it sounds it sounds simple, and it isn't always. But the more that you can demonstrate giving people what they need and then getting out of their way, um, and then coaching them as needed, uh, the better off you are. Is it a simple thing to just say that and then do it? Some people are naturals at it, and other people need coaching. Um, but yeah, it really boils down to, what is your belief about this person's ability? Um, could you make a more helpful assumption?
I think that's absolutely fantastic advice, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to take a huge amount of this on board and go and start looking at how they're kind of implementing their techniques. On that, would you like to tell everybody where they can find you and then they can access your services straight away?
Yes, absolutely. So, you can always bring me in if you're interested in having some sort of skill building training, if you want to use some of these techniques, but actually go into depth about your specific work. You can always do that, or work with me one-on-one as a leadership coach. I am taking new clients, and all of that is found at artofchange.com. If you simply want to be inspired about how people think about change, in general, sort of broaden the question out and get different perspectives, you can listen to the Changed podcast for $0. It's just available. And so the Changed podcast, there's a link on artofchange.com to the podcast, but you can also just go to the thechangedpodcast.com directly and find any listening links there. Um, I'm available in literally every podcast platform. And so that's, I found so much learning coming from listening to other people's experiences. So the Change podcast explores the question of what does it mean to be changed, to experience change, and to inspire change in others through the lens of people's stories from their fork in the road moments in life. Because I do believe that these formative experiences that we have, where we've taken one path instead of another, influence our outcomes down the line. And it's nice to think back, to listen to these stories of these moments and think back to our own and think about what we might have done differently and where that might have landed us. So there's a piece of inspiration you can just get right there.
And I would highly recommend jumping over there and having a listen, because some of the topics that I've seen on there are really cool, and really insightful and really hard hitting. So if you want more information on this, we're going to link everything in below, and then you can go there and click the links and then go and see the podcast, go and see the TEDx talk, and go and look at the website, have a little look around and see what there is for you there. Highly recommended. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Aden.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.